Benjamin Palmer adjusted his tie, feeling the familiar weight of formality settle over him. The opulent dining hall buzzed around him with low laughter and the clink of fine crystal. But he found himself withdrawn, his mind drifting back to memories that felt sharper than any detail in the room. A man of few words. Benjamin rarely attended these social gatherings, but tonight he'd made an exception, and he wasn't sure why. Halfway through the evening, a sharp wave of nausea swept over him, followed by a tightness in his chest. He gripped the edge of the table, his vision blurring slightly, and tried to breathe through it, unwilling to draw attention to himself, but the dizziness only worsened, and he realized he might need help before he collapsed in front of his distinguished guests. "Sir, are you all right?" The voice was young and steady, with a warmth he couldn't place. Looking up, he saw a woman, not much older than her mid-20s. Leaning toward him, she wore a simple uniform, marking her as one of the waitstaff, yet her eyes held a spark of determination that struck him. "Just a bit lightheaded," he replied, trying to wave her off, but she ignored his dismissal, swiftly grabbing a glass of water and kneeling by his side to offer him support. "Take slow sips," she instructed, her tone calm but assertive, as though she'd done this before. As he reached for the glass, his gaze landed on the delicate pendant around her neck. It was a simple, intricate piece, a small silver locket that looked almost too familiar. An old memory pricked at the edge of his mind. Refusing to fully take shape, the dizziness slowly faded, but Benjamin's focus was locked on that locket. He knew it was impossible. But the piece reminded him of the one he'd given his daughter years ago. His daughter, whom he'd lost in a tragic accident that had left him numb and hollow ever since. Where did you get that pendant?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman looked down, seeming surprised by his question. "This." She touched the locket, her expression softening. "I've had it for as long as I can remember. I don't know where it came from. It's the only thing I have from before. Well, from before I ended up in the orphanage." An orphanage. The words hit him like a cold slap, but he kept his expression neutral. He didn't know her story, and he couldn't let himself jump to conclusions. Still, a strange, heavy feeling settled over him, one that he hadn't felt in years. He forced a smile, nodding in polite acknowledgement, though he was already lost in thought. "Thank you for your help," he murmured, regaining his composure. She gave him a warm smile. "No problem, sir. I'm just glad you're okay." With that, she rose, melting back into the sea of waitstaff, but Benjamin couldn't bring himself to look away. That pendant, her age, it was all too close to the impossible truth he was beginning to imagine. After all these years, he had learned to live with the memory of his daughter, but something about this encounter left him unsettled. Long after the event had ended and the room emptied, Benjamin remained seated, staring at his empty plate as if it held answers. His rational mind reminded him that there were countless people in the world, each with their own stories, and it was foolish to hope that this young woman could be anything more than a stranger. But another part of him, a part he had long buried, wanted to hold on to the tiny glimmer of hope that perhaps he hadn't lost everything that tragic day. Before he could think twice, he decided he'd look into her background. It would be simple enough after all. He was Benjamin Palmer. There were few things his influence couldn't uncover that night. Back in his dimly lit study, he contacted his trusted investigator. He gave a brief description of the girl, a young waitress, dark hair, with a pendant that might have a story worth digging into. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Curiosity. "Her name's Lauren Blake," he said, recalling the name on her name tag. "Find out what you can about her." As he ended the call, Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his mind swirling with questions. Who was this young woman? And why did her presence bring back memories he'd long ago buried? What were the chances that she, out of all people, would carry a locket identical to the one he'd given his daughter? He closed his eyes, allowing himself to wonder, just for a moment, if perhaps this wasn't merely a coincidence, if perhaps fate had led Lauren Blake into his life for a reason beyond his understanding. As sleep overtook him that night, Benjamin knew he couldn't rest until he had answers, and so, with a strange mix of dread and anticipation, he braced himself for whatever truth might come to light. Benjamin Palmer woke up with the weight of the previous night still resting heavily on his mind. for the first time in years. He had dreamt of his daughter, her laugh echoing in the dream like a distant memory that felt painfully close and impossibly far. The details of the dream were hazy, but the image of the pendant, the exact pendant Lauren had worn, was as clear as daylight. He poured himself a strong cup of coffee and settled into his study, the morning sunlight filtering through the windows, casting a warm glow that felt out of place in the stillness of his thoughts. He had spent years in the world of business, acquiring knowledge, power, and influence, yet nothing had prepared him for the sense of urgency Lauren's appearance had ignited. It was as though an invisible thread had been pulled, unearthing emotions he had long since buried. He glanced at his phone. He knew his investigator, David, was efficient, but he doubted he'd have any updates this early. Still, the impulse to act drove him to send a follow-up message. "Good morning. Good. David, just checking if you found anything on Lauren Blake. I'd like all possible background information on her, especially anything related to family." He set the phone down, the moments of waiting feeling interminable. His logical mind argued with him, reminding him that this was most likely nothing, a coincidence at best, and a wild hope at worst. And yet, something in him couldn't let go. A chime sounded from his phone, and he grabbed it instantly, seeing David's name. "Morning, Mr. Palmer. I've already gathered some preliminary information. Lauren Blake, age 25, was indeed raised in an orphanage. She's been working various jobs to support herself. There's no record of biological family or parents that we've found so far. She seems clean. No red flags." Benjamin's pulse quickened as he read David's words. An orphanage. The possibility lingered in his mind, becoming more real with each passing second. How could she have his daughter's pendant? He'd never considered himself a man prone to superstition or fanciful thinking, but there was something here, something he couldn't ignore. Good work. Keep digging. Find out if there's any way to confirm more details from her past. Any hints of her origins would be useful, he replied as he pressed send. He glanced out the window, lost in thought. He could already feel himself being pulled deeper into this mystery, and he had no intention of resisting it. There were no other logical explanations for the resemblance. The pendant, the way her presence had ignited memories he thought he had forgotten. Later that day, as he prepared for a series of meetings, Benjamin found himself uncharacteristically distracted. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that pendant gleaming against Lauren's neck, and every time he thought of it, he wondered how such a delicate object had survived the tragedy that had shattered his life. Hours passed, and by late afternoon, Benjamin was back at his office. He was going through documents mechanically, his mind anywhere but on the contracts in front of him. The phone rang again. "David." "Mr. Palmer," David began, his voice steady but with a slight edge of excitement. "I did some more digging. Lauren's records are sparse, and there's almost nothing from before the orphanage took her in. But I did manage to reach out to a former employee of the place she grew up in. He remembers Lauren as a quiet girl who came into the system with nothing but a silver locket." Benjamin's chest tightened. There it was, confirmation of what he dared not even say out loud. David continued. "She was around 4 or 5 years old when she entered the orphanage, so any family connection would be prior to that. It's like she appeared out of thin air. I also looked into the circumstances of her admission. But it seems that's where the trail ends. No birth records, no prior information." Benjamin struggled to steady his voice. "Thank you, David. Keep following this. And one more thing. Can you arrange for a DNA test?" "Of course, Mr. Palmer, I'll make it happen." As he hung up, Benjamin felt a whirlwind of emotions that he hadn't felt in years. Hope, disbelief, and something that felt dangerously close to desperation. This was the closest he had ever come to finding her, the daughter he had mourned and missed every day of his life since the accident. But he knew he couldn't get ahead of himself. The test would provide him with the answer, one way or another. And until then, he would have to maintain his composure. He couldn't afford to scare Lauren away, not before he knew the truth. The next evening, Benjamin returned to the restaurant where he'd met Lauren, under the pretense of an unrelated engagement. He spotted her immediately. Moving between tables with practiced ease, her expression calm and focused. She didn't notice him right away, and he took the opportunity to observe her, watching for any small mannerisms that might feel familiar. Finally, She looked up and saw him, her surprise evident. "Mr. Palmer," she greeted him, a hint of a smile softening her features. "Back so soon," he nodded, smiling back. "I enjoyed the ambiance here. It felt welcoming." She raised an eyebrow, seeming amused. "Well, that's a first for this place, but I'm glad to hear it." They exchanged a few pleasantries, and Benjamin could feel a mix of hesitation and curiosity brewing within him. He knew he was walking a fine line, but he had to keep going. "I hope I'm not overstepping, but I couldn't help but wonder about that pendant you wear," he said carefully. It caught my eye last time we spoke." Lauren glanced down at it, her hand instinctively touching the silver locket. "Oh, I've had it forever. I don't know much about it, really. The orphanage said it was with me when I was brought in." The words hit him like a confirmation, each one adding weight to his suspicion. "Well," he said, his voice even, "it's beautiful. Reminds me of one I've seen before, a long time ago." Lauren looked up at him, her gaze searching his face for something, though she wasn't sure what. But before she could respond, a call from across the restaurant pulled her attention away. "I should get back to work," she said, offering him a polite nod. "But it was nice talking to you, Mr. Palmer." He watched her go, every part of him fighting to remain calm. As she moved away, he felt a mix of dread and anticipation at what lay ahead. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but he knew that what he would discover next might change everything. For the first time in decades, Benjamin allowed himself to believe that perhaps he was no longer alone. Benjamin knew he had to tread lightly, though the DNA test was underway. It would take days, possibly even weeks, before he had a definitive answer, and he couldn't risk pushing Lauren away. In the meantime, something about her had already shifted his world in ways he didn't fully understand. He needed to get closer, but not so close that he'd scare her off. The following afternoon, he returned to the restaurant, timing his visit toward the end of Lauren's shift. He watched from a corner as she bustled around, her movements efficient and graceful. She had the kind of quiet strength he admired, a calm presence even amid the chaos of the dining room. He waited until she finished serving the last table, then made his way over, offering a warm smile. "Lauren," he greeted, as if he hadn't planned this encounter meticulously. "Do you have a moment? I know a nearby cafe that has the best espresso in town. Thought you might like to join me." "My treat." Lauren hesitated, glancing around as if to check for other work obligations, then gave a small nod, her smile cautious but curious. "Sure. I don't think I can say no to an espresso after the day I've had." They walked down the bustling street toward the cafe, the soft hum of the city around them. Benjamin felt a strange sense of ease in her company, an odd familiarity he couldn't quite explain. "So," she started, looking at him with interest as they sat by the cafe window. "I have to ask, Mr. Palmer, why does a man like you keep coming to that restaurant? Not exactly where I'd expect to see you." Benjamin chuckled, feeling a flash of genuine amusement. "Well, maybe I'm just a fan of good food served by good people," he replied, sidestepping her question with practiced ease. He watched her reaction, noting the slight arch of her brow, as if she sensed there was more he wasn't saying. "I've never been a huge fan of fancy places," she replied, swirling her espresso thoughtfully. "I like where I work because it feels real, you know. People aren't pretending to be anything they're not." Benjamin couldn't help but smile. There was a rawness to her words, a truthfulness that resonated with him. "That's rare these days," he agreed. "But, if I'm honest, I was drawn to the place for more than the ambience." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, now you have me curious." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I suppose I felt a sense of connection when we met. I can't explain it. I know it sounds strange." Lauren looked at him, her expression softening, but a guarded look remained in her eyes. "I don't think that sounds strange," she replied. "Sometimes people come into our lives, and it feels like they were supposed to be there somehow." The conversation drifted, each of them sharing snippets of their lives without delving too deep. Benjamin spoke of his early days in business, glossing over the harshness of his journey to the top. Lauren, in turn, shared her passion for art and the sketchbooks she filled in her spare time, a hidden side of her life that she rarely spoke about. Their coffee cups emptied as the afternoon sunlight turned golden, spilling through the cafe window. Benjamin found himself reluctant to leave, but he knew better than to overstay his welcome. He glanced at his watch and smiled. "I've taken enough of your time," he said, standing and offering her a warm, genuine smile. "Thank you for indulging me. I hope I didn't bore you with stories from my business days." Lauren shook her head, a small smile on her lips. "Not at all, for a serious businessman. You're surprisingly easy to talk to." They walked out of the cafe, and he watched as she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the simple gesture stirring something protective in him. She looked at him, as if about to say something more. But then her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away. "It's my roommate," she said, apologetic. "I should probably head back, but thanks for the coffee, Mr. Palmer. Please call me Benjamin," he insisted, his voice softer than he intended. She smiled, nodding. "Benjamin, then." He watched her disappear into the crowd, her figure small but unmistakably strong. As she faded from sight, a thought tugged at him, a feeling that this connection, whatever it was, would only grow from here. He couldn't shake the sensation that fate was finally moving in his favor. Back in his office that evening, Benjamin found himself staring at a small framed photo on his desk. It was the only picture he kept out in the open, a black and white snapshot of his daughter as a toddler, laughing as she reached for him. Her small fingers were wrapped around his hand, her expression one of pure joy. His heart tightened at the memory. The loss as raw as it had been all those years ago. He closed his eyes, Lauren's face flashing in his mind, overlaying the image of his daughter. The resemblance wasn't exact, but something about her presence felt eerily familiar, as if he were getting glimpses of a life that had been cruelly taken from him. The shrill ring of his phone snapped him back to the present. It was David, his investigator. "Mr. Palmer," David began, his tone cautious. "I've arranged for the DNA test as you requested. It'll take a little time for the results, but we should have a clear answer soon." Benjamin released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Thank you, David. That's good to know." David hesitated before speaking again. "Sir, if I may, are you sure about this? I mean, if she isn't—" "I'm sure," Benjamin interrupted, a hint of steel in his voice. "I have to know." He ended the call, leaning back in his chair. He had to prepare himself for the possibility that Lauren might not be his daughter, but somehow, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was, that fate had somehow given him a second chance, however slim, to be a father again. The days that followed were filled with subtle but deliberate encounters with Lauren. Benjamin became a fixture at the restaurant, showing up often enough that she began to greet him with a smile that was warm, even welcoming. They shared small moments, quiet conversations that built a bridge between their lives, and though he remained reserved, never fully revealing his true intentions, he felt a bond forming, a fragile connection that, with each day, felt a little more like family. As the week came to a close, Benjamin found himself both anxious and hopeful, emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He knew that soon, the results would come, either confirming his hopes or shattering them completely. But as he looked back on those quiet moments with Lauren, he realized that, for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead, because regardless of the outcome, he had already been given a gift, the chance to feel alive again, even if only for a fleeting moment. Benjamin sat alone in his dimly lit study, the weight of memories pressing down on him like an anchor. It was late, and the city outside his window was quiet, its rhythm slowed to a hum under the cover of darkness. He found himself sifting through memories he had worked so hard to suppress, each one now bubbling to the surface with relentless intensity. He could still see her, the daughter he'd lost so tragically, her laughter, her quick smile, the way she would tug at his coat and tell him about her day. Each memory came back to him with startling clarity. His life had been shattered the day of the accident, the day that had taken his daughter and left him with an unfillable void. But now, Lauren's presence had stirred something in him. She reminded him of a life he had long given up on, a life that had once meant everything. This feeling, this impossible hope, left him restless, and he knew he couldn't just sit back and wait. He had to revisit the place where it had all gone wrong, where his life had split into before and after. The next day, he set out to the site of the accident, a stretch of road just outside the city. The drive was short, but with each passing mile, He felt his stomach tighten. He hadn't been there since the accident, unable to face the reality of what he'd lost. But now, as he pulled up beside the deserted stretch of road, he felt the need to confront those memories directly. He stepped out of the car, his shoes crunching over gravel as he took in the scene. The area had changed over the years. More trees, more overgrowth. But the curve in the road was the same. It was here, he remembered, where her car had supposedly spun out of control, crashing in what the police had declared a tragic accident. Yet, standing there, looking around, Benjamin's mind was filled with doubts. As he ran a hand through his hair, a strange thought took root. He had always accepted the police's conclusion, thinking it easier to accept the story as it was told. But now, with Lauren's appearance, he began to wonder, what if it hadn't been an accident? What if someone had orchestrated the entire thing to get rid of her? It was a wild idea, one that would have sounded ridiculous to him just days before. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to click into place. After all, he was a wealthy man, with powerful business interests and connections that sometimes attracted unsavory characters. He'd made his share of enemies along the way, rivals who wouldn't think twice about hurting him if it meant personal gain. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of a car approaching. It was David, his investigator, who had followed up on Benjamin's request for additional background information about the accident. "Mr. Palmer," David greeted him as he got out of his car, a file clutched in his hand. "I did as you asked. I pulled up everything on the accident from back then. Police reports, autopsy files, witness statements, everything." Benjamin nodded, his throat tight with anticipation. "Anything unusual?" David flipped through the file, his expression serious. "At first glance, it looks standard, but there's something odd about the autopsy report." He handed Benjamin the file, pointing to a particular section. There were a few bruises that were inconsistent with a simple car accident. The coroner noted them, but they didn't follow up. Given the time and your influence, it was easier for them to call it an accident and move on. Benjamin's heart sank as he scanned the report, his suspicions growing stronger. He'd been so consumed with grief back then that he hadn't questioned the investigation. But now, with fresh eyes, he saw details that had gone overlooked. "What about witnesses?" he asked, his voice tense. There was only one witness, a truck driver passing by who claimed he saw the crash. But his story was vague, almost rehearsed, as if he'd been coached on what to say. David paused, watching Benjamin closely. "It's possible someone wanted to cover up something. Mr. Palmer, I'd advise caution." Benjamin clenched his jaw, a fire igniting within him. If someone had orchestrated his daughter's death, he was going to find out who, and make them pay. They stood in silence, the weight of Benjamin's decision settling between them. He had come here to lay old memories to rest, to simply visit a place that had been off limits in his mind for so long. But now, he found himself with a new mission, one that was as dangerous as it was personal. He couldn't let this go. Not now. David spoke up, his voice measured. "If you'd like, I can reopen the case unofficially. I know a few people who owe me favors, and they might be willing to dig around without raising suspicion." Benjamin nodded. "Do it. I need answers, David." As they returned to their cars, Benjamin took one last look at the site of the crash. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, a resolve that he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for his daughter, for the life they could have had. And, he realized, he was doing it for Lauren too, whether or not she turned out to be his blood. The thought of her kept him moving forward, giving him the strength to confront the shadows of his past. Later that evening, back in his study, Benjamin sat with the file open in front of him, the details swimming in his mind. He knew that until he had concrete answers, he couldn't rest. He couldn't afford to lose focus, especially with Lauren now in his life. But with each page he read, he felt his suspicions growing stronger, each line of text reinforcing the possibility that his daughter's death had been no accident. He placed a call to David, his voice low and calm. "I want to know everything about that witness, and find out if there's anyone else who could have been on that road that night." David agreed, promising to return with any new information he uncovered. As he hung up, Benjamin felt a surge of determination. He would leave no stone unturned. He had accepted his daughter's death for too long, allowing himself to be pacified by a quick, easy conclusion. But no more. The answers were out there, buried under years of secrets, lies, and hidden agendas, and he was going to find them, no matter what it took. The morning was still and quiet when Benjamin's phone vibrated on his desk, its sound breaking the silence of his study. He reached for it slowly, as if hesitating to bring himself closer to the answer he'd been waiting for. The screen showed David's name, and Benjamin's heart raced. "Mr. Palmer." David's voice came through, steady but with a hint of tension. "The DNA results are in." Benjamin's hand tightened around the phone. For a moment he felt suspended in time, not quite ready to hear the answer that could either confirm his hopes or end them. "Go on, David." There was a brief pause before David spoke. "It's a match, sir. Lauren Blake is your daughter." Benjamin's breath hitched, his mind struggling to process what he'd just heard. All these years, he'd mourned her, believed her lost, convinced himself that his daughter was gone, and now, to learn that she had been alive all along, right there in the same city, it felt both miraculous and surreal. "She's really my daughter," he murmured, more to himself than to David. His chest swelled with a mix of relief and joy. Emotions he hadn't felt in years, but even as he felt that surge of happiness, a darker thought entered his mind. If she had survived, who had wanted him to think she hadn't? "Yes, sir, she's your daughter," David replied softly, sensing the gravity of the moment. "Do you want to tell her?" Benjamin sat back in his chair, the full weight of the situation settling over him. It wasn't as simple as announcing the truth. He couldn't just walk up to Lauren and tell her they were family, not after the years of separation and everything she had been through. He had to approach this delicately, carefully. "No," he said slowly. "Not yet, I want to tell her. But I need to understand the full picture first. If someone orchestrated that accident, they're still out there, and they'll likely stop at nothing to keep this hidden." David's voice held a tone of caution. "I understand. I'll continue the investigation. There are still some loose ends, people who might know more about what happened that night." "Good," Benjamin replied, his voice firm. "Keep me updated on anything you find." As he ended the call, Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his thoughts racing. He wanted nothing more than to walk up to Lauren, to tell her the truth, and embrace her as the daughter he had lost. But he knew he had to be patient. He had to protect her from whatever dangers might still be lurking. The later that day, Benjamin found himself in the restaurant once again, his gaze immediately drawn to Lauren as she moved gracefully between tables, greeting customers with her warm smile. He knew now, without any doubt, that she was his daughter, and the realization brought a powerful sense of responsibility. He wanted to protect her, to make up for all the years he'd lost. As she approached his table, Lauren's face lit up with surprise. "Back again?" she asked, a teasing smile on her lips. Benjamin smiled. "I hope you're not tired of seeing me yet," she laughed, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Not at all. You're one of the friendliest regulars we have. It's nice to see a familiar face." They chatted briefly, each moment deepening the bond that had grown between them. But Benjamin couldn't help feeling the weight of the truth he was keeping from her, the truth that might change her life forever. After she left his table to attend to another guest, Benjamin watched her, feeling both pride and sadness. She had become such a strong, capable woman, despite everything she must have endured. And yet, he was the one who had been absent, who hadn't been there to guide her or protect her. It was time he did something about that. Over the next few days, Benjamin focused his efforts on finding out who could have been responsible for Lauren's separation from him. The more he investigated, the more he began to suspect someone close to him, a former business partner, perhaps, or a rival who had something to gain by removing him from the equation. He pored over old files, revisited business records, and analyzed the financials, hoping to find any irregularities that might point to the mastermind behind the tragedy. As he sifted through the details, he realized just how many people in his inner circle had something to gain by his misfortune. His business empire was massive, and losing his only daughter had left a void in his line of inheritance, a void that others would be all too willing to exploit. Every lead, every clue, seemed to point him toward one man, Richard Vaughn, his former business partner and an ambitious, ruthless figure who had always been after more power. Richard had once been his closest ally, but over time, their partnership had soured. each man drifting into his own separate interests. Richard was the kind of man who could see an opportunity even in tragedy, and Benjamin couldn't shake the feeling that Richard might have known more about his daughter's accident than he'd let on. Determined, Benjamin decided it was time to confront Richard directly. He couldn't continue to live with these doubts, not when the stakes were so high. The following evening, Benjamin reached out to Richard, arranging a meeting at a quiet, upscale bar where they wouldn't be disturbed. As he walked in, he spotted Richard at a booth in the corner, nursing a glass of bourbon, his expression as sharp as ever. "Benjamin," Richard greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a long time. What brings you here?" Benjamin slid into the booth, his gaze steady. "I'm looking for answers." "Richard, I think you can help me with that." Richard raised an eyebrow, his expression a mixture of surprise and amusement. "Answers? I'm not sure I follow." Benjamin leaned in, his voice low and unyielding. "You remember my daughter? She died in that accident 20 years ago. Or at least, that's what we all thought." Richard's expression didn't change, but Benjamin noticed a flicker in his eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible flash of something close to fear. "What are you getting at?" Richard asked, his voice carefully controlled. "I think you know exactly what I'm getting at," Benjamin replied, his tone cold. "Someone arranged for her disappearance, made me believe she was gone forever, and I have reason to believe that someone close to me was behind it." Richard let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "That's a serious accusation, Benjamin. You're really digging up ghosts from 20 years ago." "What for?" "Because she's alive," Benjamin replied. Benjamin, watching Richard's reaction carefully. "My daughter survived, and now I want to know why I was led to believe she was dead." For the first time, Richard's mask slipped, and a flicker of panic crossed his face, but he quickly recovered, forcing a smirk. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Benjamin, I had nothing to do with that accident. I wasn't even in the country at the time." Benjamin clenched his jaw, his suspicions only growing stronger. "I'll find the truth, Richard, whether you help me or not. But I thought I'd give you a chance to come clean before I dig deeper." Richard scoffed, his confidence returning. "Good luck with that, Benjamin. You won't find anything. Some things are better left buried." With that, he stood up, tossing a few bills on the table for his drink before walking out. Benjamin watched him go, his fists clenched in anger. Richard's reaction had confirmed what he'd suspected. He knew something, and Benjamin was going to find out exactly what that was, no matter what it took. As Benjamin left the bar, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a resolve to uncover the truth. He knew that the journey ahead would be dangerous, filled with secrets and lies that had been buried for years. But now that he knew Lauren was his daughter, there was no turning back. It was time to protect her, once and for all. The revelation of Lauren's true identity had breathed new life into Benjamin, but it had also stirred up old fears and fresh anxieties. Each day brought a mounting sense of urgency. He couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he was running out of time, that the truth, whatever it was creeping closer and might slip from his grasp if he wasn't vigilant. In his study one evening, he found himself poring over records from decades past, searching for any link that could connect Richard Vaughn to the staged accident that had stolen his daughter. The dim glow of the desk lamp cast a narrow pool of light across his documents, and outside, the city was cloaked in darkness. As he sifted through the old files, Benjamin's phone buzzed. It was David. "Mr. Palmer," David began, his voice cautious. "I have something that might be of interest to you." Benjamin straightened, a rush of anticipation replacing the exhaustion he felt. "Go on." "I tracked down the witness from the accident, the truck driver who supposedly saw everything. His name's Robert King, and he lives just outside the city. He's retired now, but he was more than willing to talk. The thing is, his story doesn't quite add up." Benjamin's pulse quickened. "What did he say?" "He mentioned details that don't align with the accident report. He admitted that he was instructed to tell a specific version of events in exchange for a sizable sum of money. Apparently, a man approached him days after the crash, claiming it was a legal matter that needed discretion. That man. He matched Richard Vaughn's description. The confirmation hit Benjamin like a punch. All the suspicion, all the fear. It was real. Richard had been involved. He had wanted Benjamin's daughter out of the picture. But the question remained, why? David, Benjamin said, his voice laced with determination. I need you to dig deeper into Richard's dealings from that time. I don't care how far back you have to go. I want every scrap of information on him and anyone connected to him. Understood, sir. I'll keep you updated. As Benjamin ended the call, he felt a familiar fire ignite within him, one that had been dulled by years of grief and loss. If Richard had orchestrated this, if he had torn Lauren from him, forcing her into a life of struggle and solitude, there would be consequences. He would make sure of it. The next day, Benjamin arranged a visit to the restaurant, hoping to spend time with Lauren and find a way to share the truth with her. He knew that she needed to hear it, and he felt the weight of that responsibility pressing down on him. But he also knew he had to protect her from Richard's potential retaliation. The timing had to be perfect. When he arrived, he found Lauren serving a small family in the corner, her face bright with laughter. Watching her, Benjamin felt a swell of pride that surprised him. She had grown into such a resilient, kind-hearted woman, despite everything life had thrown at her. He felt a pang of guilt for all the years she had struggled without his support. Benjamin, she called out, noticing him at last. She approached, her smile warm and genuine. You really are becoming our most loyal customer, he chuckled. I suppose I can't seem to stay away. It's a habit now. They exchanged a few pleasantries, and Benjamin found himself feeling almost at ease. But the truth he was holding back lay heavy on his mind, and he could feel it building like a dam about to burst. As they spoke, Lauren looked at him, her eyes curious. You know, for someone who's so used to the business world, you have a soft spot for, well, us ordinary folks, she teased. Benjamin gave a small, wistful smile. Maybe I'm starting to see the world differently. Life has a way of surprising you, she nodded, her expression thoughtful. I get that. Sometimes I feel like I'm waiting for something that will make everything make sense. You ever feel that way? Benjamin's chest tightened at her words. She had no idea how close she was to the truth, how their lives were intertwined by a past she didn't even know existed. Before he could respond, her manager called her away, and she flashed him an apologetic smile. Duty calls, but don't be a stranger, okay? He watched her go, his resolve hardening. The truth couldn't stay buried much longer. He had to bring it to light, for both their sakes. And that evening, back in his study, Benjamin received a text from David. We need to meet. I have new information. They met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city, a place where they wouldn't be recognized. David's expression was grim as he sat down, sliding a slim folder across the table to Benjamin. What's this? Benjamin asked, his tone serious. Bank records, personal accounts, and a few old transaction logs from Richard's companies. It wasn't easy to get my hands on these, but it was worth it. Turns out, shortly after your daughter's supposed accident, there was a large transfer made to a private account overseas. The amount is significant, and it correlates to the period when that truck driver was paid off to give his false statement. Benjamin flipped through the documents, his eyes narrowing as he took in the numbers. The evidence was stacking up. Richard hadn't just staged the accident. He had paid to cover it up, to ensure that Benjamin never suspected a thing. And there's more, David continued. I found a connection between Richard and the orphanage where Lauren was placed. It appears he made several charitable donations around the time she was brought there. My guess, he wanted her somewhere safe, far from you, but still under his control in some twisted way. Benjamin's hands shook as he processed this. Richard had manipulated everything, all to gain the upper hand in their business dealings. His greed had led him to destroy Benjamin's life, to separate him from his daughter and leave her to fend for herself. I'll destroy him, Benjamin said, his voice barely a whisper, the anger simmering beneath the surface. David's expression was unreadable, but he nodded. What do you want to do next? Benjamin took a steadying breath, his mind racing. I'll confront him, but not yet. I need to tell Lauren the truth first. She deserves to know everything. The following evening, Benjamin waited outside the restaurant as Lauren finished her shift. She spotted him as she stepped out, looking surprised but pleased. Benjamin, twice in one day. Should I be worried? She joked, crossing her arms and smiling. He forced a smile, his heart pounding with the weight of what he was about to reveal. Lauren, there's something I need to tell you. It's important. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. Of course, is everything all right? He hesitated, trying to find the right words. It's about your past. There's something you need to know, something that might be difficult to hear. She looked at him, a mix of curiosity and worry in her eyes. Go on. He took a deep breath, his gaze steady. Lauren, No, I know. You're my daughter. I lost you years ago in an accident that I now believe was staged. Someone took you from me, made me believe you were gone forever, and that someone was Richard Vaughn. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, the shock evident on her face. Your daughter, she whispered, her hand moving instinctively to the pendant around her neck. But how, why? Benjamin reached out, his voice soft but steady. I don't have all the answers yet, but I'll find them. I just need you to trust me. I've been looking for you, Lauren, for as long as I can remember. And now that I've found you, I won't let anything tear us apart again. Lauren's eyes filled with tears and she stared at him, her hand trembling. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, he replied gently. Just know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. In that moment, as father and daughter stood together in the quiet street, the bond that had been torn apart years ago began to heal, inch by inch, both of them bracing for the battles that lay ahead. The revelation of their bond lingered between them like a fragile, beautiful truth. Benjamin knew he couldn't rush Lauren into accepting this new reality, but he also knew they didn't have time to linger in this newfound connection. Richard Vaughn's looming presence hung over them, his threat as real as ever. For Benjamin, protecting Lauren now was everything. In the days following their conversation, Lauren was quiet, thoughtful, as though processing a world of emotions she couldn't quite voice. She still met with Benjamin, but their interactions were more reserved, tinged with a vulnerability he had never seen in her before. Are you all right? He asked one afternoon as they walked through the city park, surrounded by the golden leaves of early autumn. Lauren looked down, brushing her hand along the leaves as they crunched beneath her feet. I don't know. Honestly, it's strange. I always felt like something was missing, like a part of my life didn't make sense, and now, here you are, telling me you're my father. It feels surreal. Benjamin nodded, understanding the weight of her words. I know it's a lot. Take all the time you need. But please know this. I'll be here for you, whatever happens. She looked up at him, a small smile softening her expression. Thank you. I believe you. But even as they spoke, Benjamin's thoughts drifted back to Richard. He could feel that his former partner was aware of his growing closeness with Lauren. Richard had likely anticipated this moment for years, knowing that if the truth ever came to light, he'd be exposed, and Benjamin had no doubt that Richard would do anything to protect himself. As if on cue, Benjamin's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number, but something told him to answer. Hello? A low, familiar voice filled the line, dripping with a cold arrogance that Benjamin recognized immediately. Hello, Benjamin. It's been too long. Richard, Benjamin replied, his tone sharp. I was wondering when you'd reach out. There was a chuckle on the other end, a dark, mocking sound. I see you've gotten close to Lauren, sweet girl, but I'll warn you, Benjamin. Digging up the past has consequences. It's not a wise move. Benjamin's jaw tightened, his voice low and controlled. You took my daughter from me. I won't let you get away with it. Oh, I've been getting away with it for years, Richard replied, his tone almost bored. But since you insist on this little family reunion, know that I'll do whatever is necessary to keep things as they are. It's for your own good, really. The threat was clear, chilling in its simplicity. Benjamin knew Richard meant every word. If he continued down this path, Lauren would be in real danger. He ended the call without another word, his pulse racing as he considered his next move. Later that evening, he met with David, filling him in on the recent threat. He's feeling cornered, Benjamin said, pacing the small office. And he's willing to strike back. David looked grim. If he's feeling threatened, he could escalate quickly. I'll increase surveillance on him, make sure we're not caught off guard. Benjamin nodded. Though his mind was on Lauren, he needed to protect her, even if that meant taking drastic measures. He couldn't allow Richard to hurt her. Not now. Not ever. There's something else we can do, David continued, a hint of reluctance in his tone. We could bring in law enforcement. We have enough on him to raise suspicion. It would give him something to worry about. Benjamin shook his head, his eyes hard. No. If we push him into a corner, he'll retaliate. I don't want to risk Lauren's safety. David nodded, understanding. Then I'll focus on keeping an eye on him and gathering more evidence. If he makes a move, we'll be ready. Over the next few days, the tension grew. Benjamin spent his time oscillating between his corporate responsibilities and his role as a father, trying to protect Lauren while quietly fortifying his defenses against Richard's inevitable backlash. One evening, Lauren arrived at Benjamin's office unexpectedly. She looked tired, her expression a mix of anxiety and determination. He waved her in, offering her a seat as he noted the worry in her eyes. "What's going on, Lauren?" She sighed, folding her hands tightly. I think someone's been watching me. There's been this car parked outside my apartment every night. And yesterday, when I was coming home from work, I swear someone was following me." A surge of anger and protectiveness washed over him. He had known Richard would play dirty, but targeting Lauren directly was unforgivable. "Why didn't you call me sooner?" he asked, his voice thick with worry. Lauren shrugged, her gaze distant. "I didn't want to overreact, but now I'm not so sure." Benjamin reached across the desk, taking her hand in his. "Listen to me, Lauren. This isn't overreacting. Someone is trying to intimidate you because they know who you are. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you." Lauren's eyes softened, her fingers gripping his hand. "I trust you, Benjamin. I do. But what do we do now? How do we keep going like this?" "We'll find a way," he promised, his mind already spinning with plans. "I'll have security posted outside your apartment, and if you're uncomfortable staying there, you can stay with me." She hesitated, but eventually nodded. "I think that might be best, at least until things settle down." He felt a mix of relief and determination. This was a temporary solution, he knew, but he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. Lauren moved into Benjamin's home that evening, her belongings neatly packed in the small suitcase she'd brought. As she settled in, Benjamin was reminded of the life they could have had together, the years they'd missed. But now, they had an opportunity to rebuild, to reclaim what had been stolen from them. They spent quiet evenings together, sharing stories, learning more about each other. Lauren told him about her childhood in the orphanage, about her love for art and her dream to one day study painting formally. In turn, Benjamin shared memories of his life before her disappearance, the dreams he'd had for their family. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Lauren looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wonder how things would have been if I hadn't been taken?" The question hung heavy in the air, and Benjamin looked down, the pain evident in his face. "Every day, Lauren, but I believe we're here for a reason. We've been given a second chance." She nodded, a soft smile forming on her lips. "I believe that too." But even in the safety of Benjamin's home, they couldn't escape Richard's looming presence. Threatening letters began arriving, anonymous but unmistakable, each one more menacing than the last. Lauren grew quiet, her confidence slowly giving way to a fear that Benjamin could see in her every movement. One night, as they read over another chilling letter, Benjamin knew he had to confront Richard. It was the only way to end this. He placed a hand on Lauren's shoulder, looking her in the eye. "This ends now. I'm going to see him tomorrow." Her face paled, her fingers gripping his arm. "Be careful, Benjamin. I don't trust him." "I know, but I can't let him control our lives any longer. Trust me. I'll handle this." She nodded, though her eyes were filled with worry. The next day, Benjamin prepared for what would likely be the final confrontation. He knew Richard would be expecting him, but he was ready. As he drove to Richard's office, he replayed everything he wanted to say, everything he needed to do to ensure Lauren's safety. He felt the weight of the threat Richard posed, the way it had tainted his life and stolen his daughter from him. This time, he would make sure it ended. He was ready to confront the man who had shattered his life and make him pay for the years he had lost. Benjamin's footsteps echoed in the quiet, polished halls of Richard Vaughn's office building. He had been here before, years ago, when he and Richard were still partners, when they were both younger men chasing their ambitions. But today, everything felt different. The building felt hollow, like a house of cards ready to collapse. Richard's secretary looked up, startled, as Benjamin strode past her without so much as a glance, his presence commanding and unyielding. She called after him, but he ignored her, pushing open the heavy mahogany doors of Richard's private office with a determined force. Inside, Richard sat at his large, modern desk, a smirk already curling on his lips as if he'd expected this visit. "Benjamin," Richard greeted him, his tone cool and collected. "I thought you might drop by, though I have to say, I didn't expect you to be so direct." Benjamin shut the door behind him, his gaze hard and unwavering. "We both know why I'm here, Richard." Richard raised an eyebrow, feigning innocence. "Do we? Please, enlighten me." Benjamin crossed the room, his voice low, but filled with an icy determination. "I know what you did. I know you're the reason I lost my daughter. You arranged for her to disappear, and you made me believe she was dead. And all of it, for what? Money? Power?" Richard's smirk only widened. "Oh, Benjamin, you sound so dramatic. Always did take things so personally, I admit. I might have had a hand in ensuring certain misunderstandings, but that was years ago. Why bring it up now?" Benjamin's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Because she's alive, Richard. Lauren survived, and now she's back in my life, and I will not allow you to take her from me again." The mention of Lauren seemed to bring a flicker of irritation to Richard's eyes, though he quickly masked it. He stood up, adjusting his cufflinks as he moved toward the window, looking out over the city as if dismissing Benjamin's anger entirely. "Well, that's quite the touching story, Benjamin, really. It's almost poetic. But here's the reality. You have no proof, and even if you did, do you really think anyone would believe you over me? You'd be laughed out of court." Benjamin took a step forward, his voice filled with a quiet intensity. "I don't need a courtroom to expose you, Richard. I have all the evidence I need. The witness you paid off, the orphanage donations, the anonymous account transfers. It's all there, and I'm not afraid to make it public." Richard's smirk faltered, just slightly. But his voice remained calm. "You're bluffing. No one would dare touch me. My connections run deeper than you realize." Benjamin felt a surge of satisfaction as he saw the first crack in Richard's confidence. "Maybe," he replied coolly, "but I'm not alone, Richard. I have friends, allies who are more than willing to see you fall. And when they do, they'll make sure there's no place for you to hide." Richard's eyes darkened, his mask slipping as anger crept into his expression. "You always were a fool, Benjamin. Soft, sentimental. That's why I did what I did. You were holding us back, and your family was a liability." The words hit Benjamin like a physical blow, but he stood his ground, refusing to let Richard see the effect of his cruelty. "Your greed destroyed everything. You stole my daughter from me, condemned her to a life of struggle. And for what? So you could have a few more million in the bank." Richard shrugged, his gaze cold. "A few more million can go a long way. Benjamin, you know that as well as I do. But here's the thing. You were too soft to see the bigger picture. I had to make choices you never could. Sacrifices." Benjamin felt a fire ignite within him, a fierce determination he hadn't felt in years. "You didn't make sacrifices, Richard. You committed crimes. And you're going to pay for them." Richard's expression hardened, his smirk disappearing entirely. "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise," Benjamin replied, his voice steady. "One way or another, you will face justice." Before Richard could respond, the door behind them opened. David entered, followed by two of Benjamin's most trusted allies from the board. They looked at Richard with contempt, each of them holding the same sense of purpose in their eyes. "Richard Vaughn," David said, his voice firm, "we have enough evidence to bury you. You can either come clean now or face the consequences. Your choice." Richard glanced between them, the weight of the situation finally settling in. His once cocky demeanor faded as he realized the walls were closing in on him. He opened his mouth to speak, but Benjamin cut him off. "It's over, Richard," Benjamin said quietly, his tone filled with finality. "You've lost." For the first time, Richard looked genuinely shaken. He took a step back, his hands trembling as he realized his options were dwindling. "You think this will stop me?" he spat, desperation leaking into his voice. "I still have connections, people who can—" "No one's coming to save you," David interrupted. "This is the end of the line." Richard's shoulders slumped, his defiance finally fading. With a heavy sigh, he dropped into his chair, his gaze a mixture of resentment and fear. Later, as Richard was escorted from the building by security, Benjamin felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over him. The man who had stolen everything from him was finally facing the consequences. Justice, in its own way, had been served. But even as he watched Richard's figure disappear down the hall, Benjamin knew that this wasn't the end. There was still healing to be done, wounds that would take time to close. He had to go to Lauren, to tell her that they were finally free. That evening, Benjamin returned home to find Lauren waiting for him in the living room. She looked up as he entered, her expression filled with a mixture of hope and worry. "How did it go?" she asked quietly. Benjamin crossed the room, sitting beside her and taking her hand in his. "It's over, Lauren. Richard won't be able to hurt us anymore." She exhaled a shaky breath, relief flooding her face. "I can't believe it. After all this time." He nodded, his gaze soft. "I know, and I'm sorry for everything you went through. I wish I could take back those years, make things right." Lauren looked at him, a gentle smile on her face. "You already are, Benjamin. You found me, and I'm here now. That's what matters." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history settling between them, no longer a source of pain but of understanding. For the first time in years, Benjamin felt a sense of peace, a quiet assurance that they could finally move forward. Lauren looked down at their hands, then back up at him, her eyes shining. "So, what now?" Benjamin smiled, squeezing her hand. "Now, we build a life together. We make up for the lost time, and we make sure that no one ever comes between us again." She leaned into him, resting her head on his shoulder as he wrapped an arm around her. In that moment, they were no longer two strangers bound by tragedy, but a father and daughter reunited, ready to face whatever the future held. As the night deepened, Benjamin and Lauren sat together, both of them feeling the quiet relief of a chapter finally closing. They didn't need words. They had all the time in the world to say everything that needed to be said. For now, they simply held on to each other, knowing that they were, at last, exactly where they were meant to be, despite the overwhelming relief that came with Richard's downfall. Benjamin knew better than to let his guard down. He had spent decades in the business world, where revenge was often a currency traded as quickly as any stock. Though Richard was being held accountable, Benjamin suspected his former partner wouldn't go down without a final act of defiance the next morning. Benjamin woke early, feeling the tension of unfinished business in his chest. He looked over at a framed photograph on his nightstand, a snapshot of his daughter as a child, her face filled with joy. It was a happiness he had missed seeing in her for too long now. He felt a duty to protect that joy, whatever it took. As he entered the kitchen, he found Lauren already awake, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. She looked up, giving him a sleepy but warm smile. "Good morning," she greeted, her tone light, though he could see hints of worry in her eyes. He offered her a reassuring smile, taking a seat across from her. "How are you feeling?" She shrugged, stirring her coffee absently. "Better, I think. It's strange. I feel relieved that Richard can't hurt us anymore, but I don't know. It feels like I'm waiting for something else to happen." Benjamin placed a gentle hand on hers. "I know the feeling, but we've come this far. We'll get through whatever comes next." She gave him a small, grateful nod, her hand squeezing his in silent support. Just then, his phone buzzed. It was a message from David. "Urgent. Meet me at the office. There's something you need to see." Benjamin felt a prickle of anxiety, but kept his expression calm for Lauren's sake. "I have to step out for a bit," he said, squeezing her hand again. "But I'll be back soon." Lauren nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "Be careful." He kissed her forehead, feeling the weight of his responsibility toward her. "I will." When Benjamin arrived at his office, David was already there, pacing with a file in hand. His face was tense, and Benjamin could sense that whatever David had discovered wasn't good. "David, what's going on?" Benjamin asked, closing the door behind him. David handed him the file, his expression grave. "After Richard was taken in, I kept digging. Just to be thorough, I found something unexpected in his communications. There's another player in this, someone Richard had been working with. It appears that they were prepared for this outcome, and they're making moves. Benjamin's pulse quickened as he scanned the documents. Another accomplice. Who? David shook his head, his frustration evident. That's the problem. Whoever this is, they've covered their tracks well. They're using encrypted channels, untraceable emails, but from the messages we intercepted, they know about Lauren, and they seem to be planning something. A chill ran down Benjamin's spine. He had thought they were close to the end, but now he realized they were just getting started. Whoever this was, they weren't about to let go of the power and leverage Richard had left behind. Do we have any idea what their next move might be? He asked, his mind racing with possibilities. David hesitated, then nodded. One of the messages mentioned targeting you directly, possibly through Lauren. It seems they believe they can still use her to manipulate you. They know she's your weakness. Benjamin clenched his jaw, anger flaring in him. They think I'll let them touch her. They're mistaken. David gave a grim nod. I figured as much. That's why I've arranged additional security for Lauren. I'll keep a close eye on her apartment and make sure she's never left vulnerable. Benjamin's mind raced as he thought through his options. He knew that protecting Lauren was the priority, but he couldn't ignore this new threat. I want to meet with this person, David, he said, his tone resolute. I'll draw them out, make them think they can get what they want, and when they do, we'll have them. David looked at him with a mixture of respect and concern. That's a risky move, Benjamin. They're already watching you closely. One wrong step, and I know the risks, Benjamin interrupted, his gaze steely. But I'm not going to live in fear. Not anymore. David nodded slowly, understanding. I'll help set it up. But please, be careful. Whoever this is, they're as ruthless as Richard, maybe even more so. The following evening, Benjamin received an anonymous message on his phone. The sender's identity was concealed, but the message was clear. They were ready to meet. They wanted to settle things face to face, to negotiate what Richard had failed to accomplish. Benjamin agreed to their terms, carefully orchestrating the meeting location in a secluded but controlled setting. He informed David of every detail, ensuring that security would be in place without being visible. He knew he was walking into a trap, but he was determined to turn it into a trap of his own. The chosen location was a private club in a quieter part of the city as Benjamin arrived. He felt the weight of the night pressing down on him. The air thick with tension. Every instinct told him to turn back, to protect Lauren by any means necessary. But he couldn't let this threat linger, not when so much was at stake. Inside, the dim lighting and luxurious decor created an atmosphere of subtle menace. Benjamin took a seat at a table near the back, his gaze scanning the room for any sign of his mysterious adversary. Moments later, a man in a dark suit slid into the seat across from him. He was young, sharply dressed, with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. He smiled at Benjamin, his expression polite but cold. "Mr. Palmer?" the man greeted smoothly. "I'm glad you accepted my invitation. It's nice to finally meet face to face." Benjamin met his gaze, his own expression unyielding. "I'm here because you're a threat to my daughter, and I don't take threats lightly." The man's smile widened, as though amused by Benjamin's defiance. "Is that so? I'd say you're the one making things difficult. You and your daughter, or should I say, your new heir." Benjamin's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" "Simple," the man replied, leaning back casually. "You step away. Let her go, and let this all fade into history. No one needs to know about the connections Richard made, or about certain arrangements left in place. In exchange, we'll let you and Lauren live your quiet little lives." Benjamin's voice was ice cold. "You want me to abandon my daughter after everything you and Richard did to us?" The man shrugged. "I see it as a choice. You walk away from this and everyone's happy, or you push and things get very messy." Benjamin leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "If you so much as come near her, I'll make sure you're the one who fades into history. Do you understand me?" The man's smile faltered, a hint of frustration appearing in his eyes. "You're making a mistake, Mr. Palmer. This can end easily, peacefully, or it can end very, very badly." Benjamin didn't blink. "I think it's time you left." The man rose, straightening his suit, his expression dark. "Very well, but don't say I didn't warn you." Benjamin watched him leave, his mind already racing with the steps he'd need to take to ensure Lauren's safety. He had sent a message of his own. He was ready to protect his daughter at any cost. Later that night, back at home, he found Lauren waiting up for him, concern etched across her face. "Did you meet them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, sitting beside her and taking her hand. "I did, and it's clear now. They won't stop unless we make them." Lauren looked down, her face tense with worry. "What can we do? I don't want you to risk yourself like this." He gave her a reassuring smile. "We've already come this far. We'll see it through together. I promise. We'll end this." As they sat together in the quiet of the night, Benjamin felt the bond between them grow stronger. A father and daughter united against a world that had tried to tear them apart. He knew the battle was far from over, but he also knew that they were no longer alone. Together, they would face whatever came next. Benjamin knew his confrontation with Richard's associate had pushed things to a breaking point. The veiled threats, the cryptic warnings, all of it pointed to an imminent danger for Lauren. He couldn't ignore the possibility that this adversary would strike soon, and he had to be ready for anything. The next evening, as Benjamin prepared to meet with David to finalize their plans for Lauren's protection, he received a phone call that sent a chill down his spine. "Mr. Palmer," a distorted voice crackled through the line, masked but unmistakably menacing. "You were warned now. It's time to see what happens when you don't listen." There was a click, and the line went dead. Heart pounding, Benjamin immediately dialed Lauren's number, but it went straight to voicemail. His pulse quickened as he realized she might already be in danger. Without wasting a second, he contacted David. "David, they have her," he said, his voice barely controlled. "They've taken Lauren." David's silence on the other end told Benjamin everything he needed to know. "We'll find her, Benjamin. I'll mobilize everyone we've got." Within minutes, Benjamin and David were in the car, racing through the city. David had tracked Lauren's phone signal to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts, a place known for its isolation. It was a location that Richard's people had used in the past to conduct business away from prying eyes. The irony wasn't lost on Benjamin. He had come full circle, facing the shadows of his past to reclaim his daughter. As they approached the warehouse, Benjamin could feel his anger simmering beneath the surface. Years of loss, grief, and regret were boiling over, and now he was ready to do whatever it took to bring Lauren home safely. They pulled up a block away, careful not to alert anyone inside. David handed Benjamin a flashlight and a small earpiece, his expression tense but determined. "We'll go in quietly. I've got backup on standby if we need them." Benjamin nodded, his gaze hardening. "Let's go." They slipped through the shadows, moving carefully as they approached the side entrance of the warehouse. Inside, the building was dimly lit, its vast empty spaces filled with an eerie silence that only heightened Benjamin's urgency. His heart pounded as he moved forward, every step bringing him closer to the daughter he'd lost once and refused to lose again. As they made their way down a corridor, they heard muffled voices from a nearby room. Benjamin recognized one of them immediately. It was Lauren. Her voice, though strained, was steady, her words defiant. "Whatever you want, I'm not afraid of you," she was saying. Benjamin clenched his fists, pride swelling alongside his anger. She was strong, even in the face of fear. He nodded at David, who positioned himself beside the door, ready to breach. On a silent count, they moved. David kicked the door open, and they stormed inside, catching the kidnappers off guard. There were 2 men holding Lauren, and at the sight of Benjamin and David, they immediately drew their weapons. But Benjamin was faster. He surged forward, knocking one of the men off balance as David tackled the other. Lauren, using the momentary chaos to her advantage, broke free from her captors and rushed to her father's side. "Dad!" she gasped, the word escaping her before she even realized it. Benjamin pulled her close, relief flooding him as he wrapped his arms around her. "I'm here, Lauren. I've got you." The remaining kidnapper struggled against David, but with one swift move, David had him subdued. Benjamin held Lauren tightly, his protective instincts fully awakened. He wasn't going to let anyone take her from him again. Once the men were restrained, Benjamin turned to face them, his voice cold and unyielding. "Who sent you?" The kidnapper glared back, his defiance clear, but Benjamin refused to back down. "Who sent you?" he demanded again, his tone sharper. One of the men finally broke under the pressure, his gaze darting to the side. It was Vaughn's orders, all right. Said to make sure you got the message. He wanted you scared. Wanted to show you he still had control. Benjamin's jaw tightened, fury sparking in his eyes. Even from afar, Richard had tried to wield his influence, unwilling to let go of the power he'd once held over them. Benjamin's voice dropped to a whisper, filled with conviction. Your time is up. Tell him he's lost. The man's gaze faltered, but Benjamin didn't wait for another response. He turned back to Lauren, his expression softening as he reached for her hand. Come on, let's get out of here. Once they were safely outside, Benjamin led Lauren to the car, his hand never leaving hers. She was visibly shaken, but she held herself with a quiet strength that filled him with pride. As they settled into the car, she looked over at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. I thought I'd never see you again, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Benjamin squeezed her hand, his voice steady. I'm not going anywhere, Lauren. Not ever again. They drove in silence, the weight of the night settling over them as they made their way back to Benjamin's home. He felt a deep sense of relief, but also a renewed sense of purpose. He had confronted Richard's allies. He had exposed the darkness that had taken his daughter from him. And now, he was ready to put this chapter behind them. When they arrived home, Lauren turned to him, her face filled with a newfound vulnerability. Dad, thank you. The word dad lingered between them, rich with meaning. Benjamin felt his heart swell, knowing that they had finally come full circle, that the bond they had rebuilt was stronger than ever. You never have to thank me, he replied softly, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. Protecting you is my job, and I'll never stop. Lauren gave him a small, teary smile, and for the first time, Benjamin saw the daughter he had loved so deeply, the daughter he had thought he'd lost forever. That night, as they sat together in the quiet of the house, Lauren told him everything she had experienced, sharing her fears and her doubts. Benjamin listened, his heart aching for the years she had struggled alone, but also filled with hope for the years they had ahead. They were a family again, stronger and more united than ever, and as the night faded into dawn, Benjamin knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The sun rose softly over the city, casting a warm glow over Benjamin's home as he and Lauren sat together, finally feeling a sense of peace that had eluded them for so long. The events of the previous night lingered between them, but they both knew the worst was over. Richard's final attempt to control them had failed, and his allies, now under investigation, would no longer pose a threat. Over the next few days, life began to settle into a new rhythm. Benjamin spent more time with Lauren, helping her adjust to her new reality. He showed her his world, the world of business, family traditions, and the life he had always wanted to share with her. And in turn, Lauren shared her own dreams and passions, things that she had once thought she would have to keep to herself. One morning, as they walked through the garden, Lauren stopped, looking up at him thoughtfully. I know this sounds strange, but I feel like I finally know who I am. Benjamin smiled, his heart swelling with pride. You've always known who you are, Lauren. You're strong, resilient, and more courageous than anyone I know. All of this, it's just a part of your story. She nodded, taking a deep breath. I want to make something of this, of us. I don't want to just live in the shadow of what happened. I want to make a difference. Benjamin looked at her, realizing just how much she had grown, even in the short time they had been together. Then let's do that. Together. Whatever you want, I'll support you. They spent the following weeks discussing plans for the future, brainstorming ways they could use the family's resources to create something meaningful. Lauren was passionate about helping young people who, like her, had been orphaned or abandoned, and Benjamin found himself drawn to her vision. They decided to start a foundation in her mother's name, dedicated to providing resources and opportunities to young people who needed a fresh start. The more they worked together, the closer they became, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Benjamin watched as Lauren transformed before his eyes, embracing her role as his daughter, finding a purpose that had eluded her for so long. On the day of the foundation's official opening, Benjamin and Lauren stood side by side before a crowd of supporters and beneficiaries. The event was held at a beautiful hall filled with flowers and laughter, a stark contrast to the darkness they had endured to reach this moment. Lauren stepped forward to address the crowd, her voice steady and clear. Today isn't just about what we've lost. It's about what we can give back, about creating hope where there was once none. My father and I are committed to building a future that empowers others, a future that turns hardship into strength. Benjamin felt a surge of pride as he listened to her speak, her words resonating with everyone in the room. She was everything he had hoped she would become: strong, compassionate, and filled with a fierce determination to make a difference. After the ceremony, as they mingled with the guests, Lauren looked at him, her expression soft. "Thank you, Dad," she said, the word carrying a depth of emotion that brought tears to his eyes. "For what?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "For never giving up on me, for fighting for us." He took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I'm the one who's grateful, Lauren. You've given me a second chance, and I don't intend to waste it." In the months that followed, Benjamin and Lauren found their lives filled with purpose, their days occupied with running the foundation, sharing family dinners, and slowly creating new memories to replace the painful ones of the past. They traveled together, visiting other cities and meeting young people who would benefit from their work, each experience bringing them closer. One evening, as they walked through the garden back home, Lauren looked at him, a gentle smile on her face. "You know, I never thought I'd have this. A family, a future." Benjamin placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice filled with quiet conviction. "You've always had it. Lauren, even when we were apart, you were always a part of me." They stood there in silence, the stars shining brightly above them, a reminder that even after the darkest of nights, there would always be light. They had faced their past, and now, together, they looked forward to a future filled with hope and love. For the first time, Benjamin felt truly at peace, knowing that he and Lauren had found their way back to each other. And as they walked back toward the warmth of their home, he knew that whatever challenges came their way, they would face them together. They were, finally, a family again.